The first time Ruth noticed the dog, it was lying flat on its side, half-shadowed under the porch rail. She didn't think much of it. Strays came and went. But by dusk, he was still there. Not begging, not barking, just watching. Ruth didn't go out to chase him. She hadn't spoken to another living soul in over 2 weeks, not since the day she buried her husband beside the barn and folded the last piece of baby clothing into the trunk she kept under the bed. Grief did strange things to time. Days melted. Chores happened out of habit. Her eyes stayed dry, but inside, something felt blistered. That night, she lit the stove and stirred beans until the silence made her pause. Through the cracked window, the dog's eyes caught the firelight. Still there. He made no move when she stepped onto the porch with a bowl and placed it near the steps. She didn't know why she was feeding him. Maybe it was pity. Maybe she was just tired of being invisible. He didn't eat. He didn't even sniff the bowl. He only looked at her. And when she went back in, he curled tighter into the wood slats like he belonged there. The next morning he was sitting upright, front paws square, tail curled around one side like he'd decided this was home. Ruth ignored him. She had fence posts to check. By the time she returned from the south field, the bowl was empty, dragged a few inches from where she'd left it. Still, no barking, no wagging tail. Just stillness, like a sentry with no one to guard. On the third day, she passed him on the way to fetch water. She expected him to flinch when her boots creaked on the steps. Instead, he shifted slightly, just enough for his flank to brush against her skirt. That tiny movement broke something in her. She walked back into the house, pulled open the trunk, and ran her hands over the soft quilt stitched with clouds and yellow stars, the one she'd made when the baby was still growing. She hadn't touched it since the snowstorm. When she looked out the window again, the dog was sitting taller than before. Waiting. For what, she didn't know. But she held the quilt just a little longer that night. By the end of the week, Ruth had stopped pretending the dog wasn't part of the house. She never opened the door without first checking if he was asleep on the top step. And when she sat in the rocking chair, mending a torn hem or listening to the wind, she could feel his presence like a heartbeat beside hers. Quiet, steady, patient. He had no collar, no brand, no name, and yet he moved like he belonged to someone once. There was a dignity to him, the way he'd turn his head when she cried, as if he knew better than to stare. Ruth didn't cry often, but sometimes the memories snuck in, her husband's cough growing weaker, the way the baby never opened her eyes after that last long night, and she'd find herself clutching the armrest like it could hold her together. The dog would inch closer then, not enough to touch, just close enough to say, "I'm still here." One morning, as she shook out the laundry near the well, she realized the dog wasn't on the porch. Panic shot through her like lightning. It was absurd. He wasn't hers, never had been, but the absence hit her harder than she expected. She turned in a full circle, scanning the yard, the road, the tree line, and that's when she saw it. Not the dog, but something else. A bundle. Just beyond the fence, nestled against the base of an old oak. At first it looked like rags, maybe discarded clothes caught by the wind, but as she stepped closer the shape became clear. A small blanket, tattered, thin, and beside it, her dog. Standing guard. His tail flicked once when he saw her approach, then stilled. Ruth dropped to her knees. Inside the blanket, swaddled tight and sleeping hard, was a child. A girl, maybe 2 years old. Dirt smudged her cheek, and her lips were dry, but she was breathing. Her chest rose and fell against the edge of the faded cloth. Ruth reached for her. The dog didn't move, just watched. No growl, no protest, just those eyes that had followed Ruth since the day he arrived. The child stirred, one tiny hand curling around the edge of Ruth's skirt. The quilt, the baby quilt, was still folded on the porch rail where she'd left it that morning to air out. Ruth didn't remember running. Only the sound of the wind behind her as she clutched the fabric and raced back toward the fence. The girl didn't cry when Ruth lifted her. She didn't resist either. Just leaned into the warmth like someone who'd been cold too long to question kindness. Ruth wrapped her in the quilt, the stars facing inward, and whispered nonsense as she carried her back to the house. The dog trotted alongside, silent as ever, but close. Close enough now that Ruth could feel his breath against her boot. Inside, she lit the stove, boiled water, and crushed dry apples into a paste. The girl watched everything with heavy eyelids but alert eyes. Ruth had raised goats once. She knew what starvation looked like. This child had seen more than hunger. She'd seen abandonment. No toddler wandered alone into the trees. Someone left her there, intentionally. That thought made Ruth grip the edge of the table harder than she meant to. The baby flinched. "I'm sorry," Ruth whispered, kneeling. "You're safe now." The girl blinked slowly. Then, softly, instinctively, she raised her arms toward Ruth's neck. That was the moment something changed. Not a loud crack, not a wail of grief, but something deeper, like a rope being retied at its frayed ends. Ruth held her through the night. She didn't sleep. Just sat in the rocking chair by the stove, staring at the shadows dancing across the girl's face. At one point she looked down and whispered, "Do you have a name?" The child didn't answer. But the dog, curled near the hearth, opened one eye. Ruth chuckled dryly. Didn't think so. The next morning she found herself washing the child's feet with warm cloths. She cut up a shirt to sew makeshift diapers and tucked dried mint in the corners of the room to freshen the air. She hadn't done any of this since before the storms came. Since the baby didn't come home from the midwife. Around noon, she stepped out to fetch more water. And that's when she noticed it. The dog had dragged the empty food bowl to the base of the stairs again. Next to it, carefully placed, was a tiny wooden horse. It was old, the kind her late husband used to carve when he was dreaming of the daughter they'd never hold. Ruth picked it up slowly. The child reached for it as soon as she returned. Like she already knew it was hers. Like she already knew this porch. Ruth didn't name the girl right away. Names had weight. Names meant staying. But when the child took her first steps on the porch, arms out, unsteady but determined, Ruth felt something shift in the air. The dog rose beside her, alert as always, as if waiting for confirmation. "Clover," Ruth whispered without thinking. The word fell out of her mouth like it had been waiting for years. Not Daisy, not Rose. No, Clover. A small thing that survived storms. A green thing in the dirt that came back, even after frost. The girl turned her head, as if she knew. As if she'd been Clover all along. That evening, Ruth told the name to the stars. She stood outside while Clover napped and the dog patrolled the yard. "Her name is Clover," she said aloud. "I don't know if you had plans for her, but she's got mine now." The wind answered with a hush that felt like approval. A week passed. Clover learned to laugh. Ruth hadn't heard laughter in the cabin since before her husband's last breath. It started when the dog brought her a pine cone, dropped it at her feet, and tilted his head. Clover mimicked the gesture, then burst into giggles that made Ruth drop the laundry just to listen. She'd never believed in miracles. She still didn't. But she believed in small resurrections, giggles, pine cones, and the sound of a child breathing easy through the night. She started leaving the front door ajar during the day, just in case someone came looking. Not because she wanted to give Clover back, but because she needed to know. Who would abandon her? Why? No one came. Until one gray morning, Ruth heard hooves on the road. She squinted through the window and saw a wagon, battered and tilting left. A man climbed down slowly. He looked too clean for a traveler, too polished for this road. Ruth's breath caught when she saw what he carried. A folded blanket. Not hers, not one from the house, but familiar. In his other hand, Clover's wooden horse, identical, except this one had a carved C on its underside. The dog stood between Ruth and the door now, stiff and still. Clover, clutching her own toy, toddled to the window and smiled. Ruth didn't move. The man hadn't knocked. He just stared at the porch. At the girl, then he turned and walked away. Ruth didn't sleep that night. She kept the lamps low and watched Clover from the rocking chair, her thoughts racing like a runaway team. The man hadn't spoken. He hadn't even looked confused. He had stood there, calm as a preacher, holding a second version of the very toy Clover now gripped in her sleep. Ruth waited for the knock that never came. By morning, her decision was made. She dug up the old lockbox buried behind the barn. Inside were the documents she and Nathaniel once used to file homestead claims, receipts from the sale of their mule, and, underneath, 3 of Nathaniel's carving tools, still wrapped in the oilcloth she hadn't opened since his funeral. Ruth ran her fingers over the blades. Her hand remembered the weight of them, though it had been years. At noon, she carved a new horse. Not perfect, but strong. She placed it beside Clover's toy on the porch bench. When the sun dropped behind the ridgeline, there were 2 wooden horses on the rail. By dawn, only one remained. That night, Clover whimpered in her sleep. Not a cry, but the sound of someone remembering something they didn't want to. Ruth pulled her close, sang what little she remembered from a lullaby, and for the first time, Clover clung to her like a child who knew what she was asking for. The next day, Ruth saw footprints near the creek. Not animal, not hers. A boot print, deep and angled. Someone had been watching. The dog had noticed, too. He no longer wandered far. He kept himself between Clover and the woods, eyes never still. On the 3rd morning, Ruth found another item on the porch. A woman's handkerchief, delicate and white, knotted tightly around something small. Inside it was a ring. Silver, child-sized, with a dull green stone in the center. Ruth froze. It matched the one Nathaniel had given her years ago, the one buried with their stillborn daughter. She turned the ring over. Inside the band, a faint engraving. CLN. The initials didn't match hers, or Nathaniel's, but the N sent a tremor down her spine. That evening, Ruth bathed Clover in silence. The child laughed at the soap bubbles. Ruth didn't. She was too busy wondering who was leaving these things, who knew about Clover, and why did it feel like someone was returning, not to take, but to atone. 2 days passed with no new tokens, but Ruth's unease grew heavier. The woods felt different now, not dangerous, just watched. Clover began to recognize sounds, turning toward every wind chime jingle, every creak of the porch boards, as if expecting someone. Ruth caught herself doing the same. On the 3rd morning, she walked to the mailbox she hadn't used in months. Dust coated the inside, but nestled there, neatly folded, was a letter. No stamp, no address, just her name. In a hand she didn't recognize, yet somehow did. She opened it right there under the rising sun. "You have her. I won't take her. But I need you to know why she was left, not to abandon, to protect. They were going to sell her, Ruth. I paid what I could and ran. She's safe because of you. Let me keep her safe too. From afar. N. The paper trembled in her hands, not just from the wind, from memory. The only man who'd ever written her that way was Nathaniel. But Nathaniel was dead, buried with the carving tools and her last sense of certainty. Ruth read the note 5 times. The dog barked once, softly, then turned towards the woods. Ruth followed his gaze and saw a flicker of red fabric, not close, not moving, but present. She picked up Clover, heart pounding, and stepped outside. "You watching?" she called. No answer. She raised the letter. "Then hear me right. I'm not scared of you, but I'll die before she's taken again." That night she left food on the porch, just bread and jerky. By dawn, it was gone. No footprints, no signs, just another small item left behind. A photograph, torn at the edge, faded, but unmistakable. A young Lakota woman, hair braided, standing beside a white man Ruth had never seen, but Clover's eyes mirrored his exactly. Ruth sat on the porch steps, holding the photo until her fingers ached. Clover toddled up behind her, leaned into her side, and pressed the wooden horse into Ruth's lap. "Mama," she whispered. It wasn't the first time she'd said it, but this time Ruth believed her, because names meant staying, and Clover had chosen hers. Somewhere in the forest, someone was letting go, but not walking away, not anymore. That night, the wind shifted. Ruth smelled smoke before she saw it, faint but unmistakable, not the sharp sting of something destroyed, but the earthy scent of sage and pine burning slow, controlled. She stepped onto the porch with Clover in her arms and scanned the tree line. Just beyond the field's edge, a single flame flickered, then 2. Not wild. Placed, like signals. The dog sat beside her, ears forward, unmoving. Ruth held Clover tighter, unsure whether to feel threatened or seen. Then she remembered the photograph, the toys, the ring, the offerings. She watched until the flames died. No sound followed. The next morning, near the edge of the corn rows, she found what had burned. A small medicine bundle, tied in red cloth, left with care. She brought it inside and unwrapped it with trembling fingers. Inside were items she didn't understand. A feather, some beads, a stone with a mark etched into it, but also a child's drawing on brittle paper. It showed a man, a woman, and a little girl. The figures held hands. Ruth stared at it for a long time. She didn't know if it was a wish or a memory. That afternoon, a rider came up the path. Not the silent one, but the sheriff. He tipped his hat, glanced at Clover, and hesitated. "Got some folks asking questions," he said. "Child like hers went missing months back, but now they say the man who bought her never made it far." Ruth kept her face still. "You think I'd hide someone like that?" she asked. The sheriff shrugged. "I don't think nothing. But you've had visitors, and I reckon someone don't want her found." Then he rode off without another word. That night, Ruth couldn't sleep. She sat by the fire, Clover curled against her chest, the medicine bundle on the table beside her. Every instinct screamed to run, but something deeper told her to stay, that if she left, she'd only be teaching Clover the same thing everyone else had taught her, that love disappeared when it got hard. And Ruth had never wanted to be like them. So she stayed. When dawn came, a single wooden carving sat on the porch rail. This time it was of a woman holding a child. No horse, no man, just the two of them. Ruth stepped outside, pressed her lips to the figure's head, and whispered, "So be it." The knock came just past noon, sharp and deliberate, not like the wind or the soft pawing of the dog. Ruth froze, knife halfway through a potato, while Clover sat humming on the floor with her carved animals. The knock came again. She opened the door slowly, heart pounding, fingers gripping the handle so tightly it hurt. A man stood there. Not old, not young, with long, dark hair tied back, a rawhide jacket dusted with travel, and eyes so familiar they stole the breath from her chest. He held nothing but his hands, palms open as if to show he meant no harm. "I'm not here to take her," he said quietly. His voice had the weight of sleepless nights and unsent letters. "I just need to see her. Just once." Ruth didn't answer. Clover had already toddled to the doorway, holding the horse in one hand and the carved mother in the other. She looked up at the man, blinked twice, then slowly reached forward and touched his leg. "You came," she whispered. He dropped to one knee, tears forming instantly. "Yes, little leaf, I came late, but I came." Ruth watched them in silence, every fiber of her body torn between fear and something much older. The man didn't ask to come inside. He just stayed kneeling, letting Clover touch his hair, his jacket, his tears. "She remembers the carvings," Ruth said finally, "and the song you left on the wind." He looked up at her, eyes wet, voice breaking. "I was a coward, but I paid everything I had to save her from what they were going to do. I didn't think I had a right to raise her." Ruth stepped out, standing beside them now, the wind pulling gently at her sleeves. "You still might not," she said softly. "But she already chose who to call Mama. You're not here to change that, are you?" He shook his head, eyes never leaving the child. "Number, I'm just here to build her a fence, plant her corn, be near enough if the wind turns cruel again." Ruth looked down at Clover, who had crawled into the man's lap and fallen asleep, trusting, warm, complete. She nodded slowly. "Then I guess we've all come late," she whispered. "But maybe not too late." Ooh. By the end of the week, the man had built a fence, not just around the garden, but around the entire cabin. Strong posts set deep, beams tied with care, like he was keeping something sacred in rather than danger out. Ruth watched him from the porch with Clover on her hip, noting how he moved. Measured, never rushing, like he was making peace with the land one rail at a time. He never stayed the night. He would work until dusk, then disappear into the trees, leaving behind the scent of pine smoke and the low whistle of a tune no white man knew. Ruth didn't ask questions. Clover didn't cry when he left. It was like they understood he'd return before the frost ever dared fall. One evening, Ruth brought him bread and rabbit stew in a tin. He nodded thanks, sat on a tree stump outside the fence, and ate without speaking. When he finished, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and finally asked, "Did she talk to you before I came?" Ruth nodded. "Little bits, a few words. But she always called me Mama, from the first week." He smiled faintly, pain tucked beneath the curve of his lips. "She had a sister. Died that winter. I buried them both once. Her and the life I was supposed to have." Ruth lowered herself onto the dirt beside him. "You buried grief, but maybe not love." They sat in silence for a while. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out the final carving, a woman with 2 children. One stood tall, the other perched on her hip. "This one's not for Clover," he said. "It's for you." Ruth took it carefully, eyes scanning the details. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. She looked at him then. Truly looked. Not at the man who had once disappeared, but at the one who showed up each morning, hammer in hand, soul in pieces, trying to build something that could hold against the storm. "She's not the only one learning how to belong," she whispered. He nodded, stood, and without a word, returned to the posts. Ruth held the carving against her chest. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows, but the fence stood tall, and for the first time in years, so did she. Clover woke before dawn that morning, wandered barefoot across the creaky floor, and tugged at Ruth's skirt where she stood stoking the fire. "He's here," she whispered, eyes still heavy with sleep. Ruth didn't ask how she knew. She'd come to trust the child's instincts more than her own. She wrapped Clover in her shawl and stepped outside, the sky still lavender with sleep. There he was, already crouched near the barn, fixing a hinge without anyone asking, like he'd always belonged. Ruth watched him work in silence, Clover cradled in her arms, until the girl wriggled down and ran barefoot across the dewy grass. "Papa," she said simply, not loud, not unsure, just like she was naming something she'd always known. He turned. The tool dropped from his hand. For a full breath, he didn't move. Then he dropped to his knees in the dirt and opened his arms. Clover ran into them like a bird that had finally found its sky. Ruth felt something crack open in her chest, a wound she hadn't even named beginning to close, not because someone fixed it, but because someone stayed. Later that morning, as they shared corn cakes and honey at the porch, he turned to Ruth. "I have no tribe anymore," he said quietly, "but I have her. And if you'll let me, I'd like to build more than fences here. I'd like to build whatever she needs, whatever you need." Ruth didn't answer right away. She looked at the carving still resting on the mantel inside, the mother, the two children, unfinished in its way but whole in its heart. "You'll never have to earn her love," she said finally. "You gave her life twice, but mine, you'll have to be patient with that." He nodded, no pride in his face, only gratitude. "I can wait," he said. "I've waited this long." Ruth reached out, touched his hand. "Then let's start by planting that corn you talked about, and maybe some wildflowers too. She likes those." From the porch, Clover giggled as the dog leapt after a grasshopper. The wind was gentle that morning, and for the first time in many winters, the cabin didn't feel like something patched together from loss. It felt like a home. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had seen her call him that, would you have believed in second chances too? Tell us in the comments.